Stand down, officer, that's not a request. The words would echo in his head later, long after the sunlight had shifted and the crowd had gone silent, but right now, under the clear, unforgiving brightness of a late morning sky, Officer Daniel Hayes believed he was in complete control. It was 10:42 a.m., the kind of day where the sun didn't just shine, it exposed everything. The sidewalks of downtown Baltimore buzzed with movement, heels clicking against concrete, car engines idling at red lights, snippets of conversation drifting through warm air that carried the faint scent of roasted coffee from a nearby cafe. People moved with purpose, eyes forward, schedules tight, unaware that in less than a minute, something small, almost routine, would fracture that rhythm. Angela Brooks walked along the edge of the street with measured steps, her posture upright, her expression calm, dressed in a tailored navy blazer and neutral slacks that blended professionalism with quiet authority. Nothing about her demanded attention, yet nothing about her could be ignored either. There was a stillness to her, the kind that didn't come from uncertainty, but from control. In her right hand, she held her phone loosely, not scrolling, not distracted, just present. Then came the shift. A shadow moved across her path before the voice followed. I need you to stop right there. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the noise like a blade. Angela slowed, then stopped, turning just enough to face the source. Officer Daniel Hayes approached with a firm stride, one hand resting near his belt, the other gesturing with casual authority that suggested he had done this 1,000 times before. His uniform was crisp, badge catching the sunlight in sharp glints, his jaw set in a way that signaled not aggression, but assumption. Is there a problem, officer? Angela asked, her voice even, controlled, neither defensive nor submissive. Just a question. But Daniel didn't answer it directly. His eyes moved over her quickly, too quickly, taking in details without understanding them, forming conclusions without evidence. We've had a report, he said, tone flattening into procedure, and you match the description. A few heads turned nearby. Not many. Just enough. The kind of attention that builds slowly, like pressure before a storm. Angela didn't move. What description is that? She asked. A pause. Not long. But long enough. Daniel exhaled through his nose, shifting his stance slightly, impatience flickering beneath the surface. I'm going to need you to place your hands behind your back. The words landed heavier than they should have. Not because of their volume, but because of what they implied. Around them, the city didn't stop, but it leaned in. A man across the street slowed his walk. A woman near the cafe window lifted her phone just a little higher. Someone whispered something that didn't quite carry. Angela's gaze didn't break. Officer, she said, quieter now, I haven't done anything wrong. For a split second, something unreadable passed through Daniel's expression. Doubt? Maybe. Or maybe just irritation at being questioned. It disappeared as quickly as it came. I'm not going to ask again. The shift was complete. Authority had turned into enforcement. Angela inhaled slowly, the kind of breath that steadies more than just the body. Then, without resistance, she turned and placed her hands behind her back. The metal clicked into place. Sharp. Final. Audible enough that the surrounding noise seemed to dip for half a second. Imagine standing there. In the middle of a bright, ordinary day. Surrounded by strangers who don't know your name, your story, or your truth. And hearing that sound, not as protection, but as judgment. Angela didn't flinch. Didn't protest. Didn't look away. Her eyes remained forward, focused on something beyond the moment, as if this, right here, was not the end of the story, but just a point along a path she already understood. Daniel tightened the cuffs slightly, routine, practiced. To him, this was procedure. Another call. Another report. Another situation handled. But something about the silence around her, about her, felt off. No panic. No raised voice. No desperate explanation. Just stillness. And in that stillness, something else began to grow. Not fear. Not yet. But the faintest crack in certainty. Because under the same sunlight that illuminated his badge, it also revealed something he hadn't considered. The woman standing in front of him wasn't reacting the way people usually did. She wasn't asking for help. She wasn't arguing. She was waiting. And somewhere in the distance, a siren echoed, not approaching, not urgent, just part of the city's constant hum, but for a brief moment, it felt like something else entirely. Like a warning. Daniel straightened, guiding her a step forward. "We'll sort this out at the station," he said, more to the situation than to her. Angela finally spoke again, her voice calm, almost quiet enough to be missed. "Officer, do you mind if I make a call?" It was a simple question. Reasonable. Harmless. But the way she said it, steady, precise, without a trace of urgency, didn't match the moment. Daniel hesitated. Just for a second. Then nodded. "Make it quick." He didn't know why that second felt longer than it should have. He didn't know why the air seemed to tighten, why the eyes around them felt heavier, why the sunlight, so clear just moments ago, now felt like it was revealing something he couldn't yet see. But in less than a minute, everything he thought he understood about this moment was about to change. Daniel Hayes had heard that tone before, the kind people used when they were trying to sound calm even though they were not, but this was different because there was no strain in Angela Brooks's voice, no hesitation, no tremor that suggested fear or urgency, just a quiet certainty that did not match the situation unfolding under the open sky, and for a brief moment as he handed her the phone from her own grasp, he felt something shift in the air around them, something subtle but undeniable. Like the temperature had dropped a few degrees even though the sun was still high and bright above the city streets, Angela lifted the phone slowly, her movements controlled, deliberate, as if every second mattered but none of them needed to be rushed, and the small crowd that had gathered did not move closer, did not speak, they simply watched, their attention drawn not by noise but by the absence of it, by the strange calm that surrounded her while she stood. There in handcuffs in the middle of a busy morning, Daniel adjusted his stance, glancing briefly toward the people filming, then back at her, his jaw tightening as he reminded himself that this was routine, that calls like this happened all the time, that people always asked to call someone, a lawyer, a friend, anyone who might make the situation feel less real, but something about the way Angela dialed the number, without looking down for long, without second-guessing, without asking for permission again, did not feel routine at all. She placed the phone to her ear and waited, not pacing, not shifting her weight, just standing still, and when the line connected, she spoke only a few words, her voice low but clear enough that Daniel could hear the shape of them even if he could not catch every syllable. "This is Angela Brooks, badge verification code Delta 79. I need immediate confirmation on a field situation," and then she paused, listening, her eyes lifting slightly toward the horizon as if the answer was already there waiting for her. Daniel frowned, a small crease forming between his brows as he tried to process what he had just heard. Badge verification, field situation, those were not the kinds of phrases people used when they were trying to call for help. Those were the kinds of words that belonged to a system, to an internal structure he was not fully part of, and yet he pushed the thought aside almost immediately, convincing himself that it could mean anything, that people said all kinds of things when they were nervous, that this was still under his control. The city noise returned in fragments, a car horn in the distance, the hum of an engine idling too long, the soft murmur of someone whispering behind him, but it all felt slightly muted now, like it was happening behind glass, separated from the moment unfolding right in front of him. Angela spoke again, even quieter this time. "Yes, location confirmed, officer present," and then she lowered the phone, ending the call without another word, without explanation, without even a glance at him, as if the conversation she had just had was already complete, already set in motion. Daniel exhaled slowly, forcing a small, dismissive shake of his head as he reached for his radio, not because he needed to use it, but because it gave his hand something to do, something familiar, something grounding. "All right," he said, his voice returning to that firm, procedural tone. "We are done here, we will sort everything out at the station," but even as he spoke, the words felt less solid than they had just minutes ago, like they were no longer anchored to the certainty he had felt when he first stepped into her path. Angela did not respond, she simply stood there, her posture unchanged, her expression steady, and that stillness began to press against him in a way he could not explain, because it was not resistance, it was not defiance, it was something else entirely, something closer to patience, the kind that comes from knowing how something will end before it even begins. Then it happened, not loudly, not dramatically, just a faint crackle from the radio clipped to his shoulder, the kind of sound he usually ignored without thinking, but this time it cut through everything, sharp and precise. Unit 7-4, confirm status. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, not the usual dispatcher, not the routine tone he was used to hearing throughout his shift, and for a split second, Daniel did not answer, his hand hovering near the device as he glanced down at it, then back up at Angela, whose eyes met his for the first time since the call ended. There was no anger in her gaze, no triumph, just that same quiet certainty, and in that moment, the sunlight felt different, no longer just bright, but revealing, exposing every detail, every decision, every assumption that had led them both to this exact point on this exact street at 10:47 in the morning. And for the first time since he had approached her, Daniel Hayes felt something he had not expected to feel at all, not in a situation like this, not in the middle of his shift, not in front of a crowd that had already decided who he was supposed to be. He felt uncertain, and that uncertainty did not come from what had happened, but from what was about to happen next. The radio crackled again, sharper this time, no longer background noise but a presence that demanded attention. Unit 7-4, respond immediately, the voice repeated, calm but carrying a weight that did not belong to routine dispatch traffic, and Daniel felt his fingers tighten slightly around the edge of the device as he finally pressed the button. This is 7-4, I have a situation under control, he said, his tone firm, measured, the same tone he had used countless times before, but even to his own ears, something in it sounded different, like it was trying a little too hard to hold its ground. There was a brief pause on the other end, not long, just enough to stretch the moment, enough to let the silence press in from all sides, and then the response came, slower, more deliberate. 7-4, confirm the identity of the individual in your custody. The wording was precise, almost clinical, and it sent a faint ripple through Daniel's thoughts because that was not how these exchanges usually went, not on a street stop. Not in broad daylight with a crowd watching. He glanced at Angela, standing exactly where she had been, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady, as if she had already heard the question before it was even asked, as if she already knew what he would say next. Female, Daniel replied, choosing his words carefully, approximately mid-30s, no identification provided yet, and as soon as the sentence left his mouth, he felt it, that subtle shift again, like something had just been placed on record, something that could not be taken back or rewritten. The city seemed to hold its breath for a fraction of a second, the sunlight reflecting off windows, off passing cars, off the small glass screen of a phone held up by someone across the street, capturing everything, preserving every word, every movement, every decision. The radio remained silent for a beat longer than it should have, and then the voice returned, no longer neutral, no longer routine. 7-4, maintain position and do not proceed further. The instruction landed with a quiet finality that made Daniel's chest tighten just slightly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for him to feel it, a crack forming beneath the surface of his certainty. Dispatch, I have probable cause, he responded quickly, almost reflexively, as if speed alone could reinforce authority. I am transporting for further verification. But even as he spoke, his eyes flickered back to Angela, searching for something, a reaction, a sign, anything that would align this moment with the countless others he had handled before, but there was nothing there except that same calm, that same unshaken composure that now felt less like compliance and more like control. The voice on the radio did not rise, did not argue, it simply returned, steady and unmistakable. 7-4, you are being instructed to stand down, and this time, there was no ambiguity, no room for interpretation. The words carried a weight that did not come from volume but from authority, the kind that moved through systems, through ranks, through structures that operated far above the level of a single officer on a city street. A murmur rippled through the small crowd, subtle but growing, as people sensed the shift without fully understanding it. Phones lifted a little higher, eyes sharpened, attention locking onto the unfolding moment as if they could feel that something had just crossed an invisible line. Daniel swallowed, the motion small but deliberate, and for the first time, he hesitated not because he did not know what to do, but because he was no longer certain that what he had already done was enough to hold the ground beneath him. Angela spoke then, not loudly, not forcefully, but with a clarity that cut through the tension. "Officer Hayes," she said, using his name without asking, without guessing. "You might want to listen carefully," and the way she said it was not a warning, not a threat, just a statement, simple and precise. Like everything else about her, Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of confusion passing through his expression as he processed the fact that she knew his name, that she had not asked for it, that she had not needed to, and before he could respond, the radio came alive again, this time with a different voice, deeper, unmistakably authoritative. "Officer Daniel Hayes, badge number 7421, this is Internal Affairs Command." The words landed like a shift in gravity itself, subtle but undeniable, pulling everything into a new alignment. "You are to release the individual immediately and await further instruction." And just like that, the moment fractured, the certainty he had been holding onto slipping through his grasp, not in a sudden collapse, but in a slow, irreversible unraveling. The sunlight still shone, the city still moved, the crowd still watched, but nothing felt the same anymore, because the power he thought he carried in that badge, in that uniform, in that moment, was no longer his alone, and standing in front of him, still calm, still composed, still exactly where she had been from the beginning, Angela Brooks did not look like someone who had just been stopped on the street. She looked like someone who had been waiting for the truth to arrive, and now that it had, there was no rushing it, no stopping it, no turning away from what it was about to reveal. For a moment, no one moved, not Daniel, not the people watching, not even the traffic that seemed to slow, as if the entire street had leaned into a silence that was no longer passive but expectant, and the words from the radio lingered in the air like something that could not be undone. "Internal Affairs Command," not a phrase you heard in routine stops, not a voice that reached out unless something had already crossed a line that could not be ignored. Daniel's hand hovered near the cuffs, not touching them, not releasing them, caught in that narrow space between instinct and instruction where everything suddenly felt heavier than it should have, and for the first time since this moment began, his training did not immediately tell him what to do next. He glanced at the faces around him, the phones now clearly raised, recording, documenting, capturing angles he could not control, and in those small glowing screens, he caught reflections of himself, uniform sharp under the sun, posture firm, but something else layered beneath it, something that did not belong to confidence anymore. Angela Brooks remained still, her wrists secured but her presence unchanged, and there was no urgency in her expression, no push to rush the outcome, just a quiet awareness that the moment had already shifted in a way that could not be reversed. Daniel cleared his throat, a small, controlled sound, as if resetting himself, as if that could bring the situation back into something familiar. "Dispatch," he said into the radio, his voice measured, "confirm that transmission," but even as he spoke, he knew that confirmation had already been given in a way that did not require repetition. The response came almost immediately, the same authoritative tone, unwavering. "Officer Hayes, you are to comply immediately, remove restraints and remain on site." And this time, there was no pause afterward, no space for interpretation, just the weight of instruction settling firmly into place. A murmur spread through the crowd, more audible now, not loud enough to disrupt, but strong enough to signal that everyone understood something significant was happening, even if they did not know the full story, because they did not need to. The shift in power was visible, tangible, unfolding in real time under the same sunlight that had exposed everything from the beginning. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, not in defiance, but in the effort to hold on to composure, to maintain the image of control even as it slipped through his fingers, and slowly, almost mechanically, he reached for the cuffs. The metal cool against his fingers as he adjusted them, the small click of release echoing far louder than it should have in the open air. Angela lowered her hands as the restraints came free, not rubbing her wrists, not stepping away quickly, just allowing the moment to complete itself with the same calm she had carried from the start. And when she turned slightly to face him fully, there was no anger in her eyes, no visible triumph, just clarity, the kind that does not need to announce itself because it is already understood. Daniel stepped back half a pace, the distance small but significant, creating space where there had been none, and for a brief second, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching just long enough for everything to settle into its new shape. Then Angela reached into her jacket pocket, her movement steady, deliberate, and retrieved a small leather holder, opening it just enough for him to see, not thrusting it forward, not making a show of it, simply presenting it as fact. And inside, the badge caught the sunlight in a way that was unmistakable, federal insignia, identification that did not require explanation. Daniel's eyes locked onto it, the details registering one by one. Not all at once, because understanding like that does not arrive instantly. It builds, piece by piece, until there is no room left for doubt. "Angela Brooks," she said, her voice even, Senior Oversight Division, and she closed the holder just as calmly as she had opened it, tucking it back into place as if the reveal itself was not the point, as if it had never been about proving anything, only about allowing the truth to surface when it was ready. Around them, the crowd reacted in small ways. A shift in posture, a collective intake of breath, a quiet ripple of realization moving through people who had come expecting to witness something ordinary and were now watching something entirely different unfold. Daniel straightened instinctively, but the motion felt different now, no longer rooted in authority, but in adjustment, in recalibration, as if he were trying to align himself with a reality that had changed without warning. The radio crackled once more, the same voice returning. "Additional units are en route," and this time, it did not sound like backup. It sounded like confirmation, like the next step in a process that had already begun long before this street, this moment, this interaction. Angela glanced briefly toward the sound, then back at Daniel, and in that look, there was no hostility, no satisfaction, just a quiet acknowledgement of what had unfolded, of what it meant, and of what would come next, because under the bright, unfiltered light of that late morning, nothing had been hidden, nothing had been softened. Everything had been seen exactly as it was, and that was something no badge, no uniform, no assumption could change once it had been brought into the open. The sound of approaching vehicles did not arrive all at once. It built gradually, low at first, almost indistinguishable from the steady rhythm of the city, then clearer, more defined, until the presence of additional units became undeniable, not rushed, not chaotic, but precise, controlled, like something that had been set in motion long before this moment ever unfolded on this street. Daniel Hayes stood where he was, his posture still upright, but no longer anchored in certainty, his hands now empty, the absence of the cuffs more noticeable than their presence had been, and for the first time that morning, he did not reach for his radio, did not adjust his stance, did not attempt to reclaim the narrative that had already moved beyond him. Angela Brooks remained composed, her shoulders relaxed, her gaze steady as she watched the scene evolve, not with anticipation, not with satisfaction, but with the quiet focus of someone who had seen this process before, someone who understood that what mattered was not the moment of reversal itself, but what followed after it. The first vehicle came into view at the corner, dark, unmarked, its movement smooth and deliberate as it pulled to the curb, followed by another, and then a third, each one arriving without urgency yet carrying a presence that shifted the atmosphere completely. And as the doors opened, the individuals who stepped out did not rush forward, did not raise their voices, they simply moved with purpose, their expressions neutral, their attention fixed on the scene that had already been documented from every angle. The crowd responded in subtle ways, stepping back just slightly, creating space without being told, their phones still raised but their whispers quieter now, as if the weight of what they were witnessing had finally settled into something real, something that could not be dismissed as a misunderstanding or a routine encounter. One of the agents approached first, his suit unremarkable, his demeanor calm, and he stopped a few feet from Daniel, offering a brief nod that was neither friendly nor hostile, simply professional. "Officer Hayes," he said, his voice even, "we will take it from here," and there was no question in the statement, no room for negotiation. Just a clear transfer of control that did not need to be emphasized because it was already understood. Daniel opened his mouth slightly, as if to respond, to explain, to clarify, but the words did not come immediately, not because he did not have them, but because he was no longer sure which ones would hold any weight in this moment, and that hesitation, brief as it was, spoke louder than anything he could have said. Angela stepped forward then, just enough to close the distance between herself and the arriving agents, her presence aligning naturally with theirs, not as someone being assisted, but as someone who belonged within that structure. And when she spoke, her tone remained steady. "The interaction began at approximately 10:42 a.m., she said, her words precise, measured, public location, multiple witnesses, no escalation from my side, and as she continued, the details unfolded not as accusations, but as facts, each one placed carefully into the space between them. Each one reinforcing the reality that had already been captured in real time. Daniel listened, his expression controlled, but the shift in perspective was unavoidable, because for the first time, he was not the one presenting the situation, not the one shaping how it would be understood. He was part of it, a subject within a narrative that was no longer his to direct. The agent nodded once, acknowledging the information without interruption, then glanced briefly toward the individual still recording, the quiet audience that had become an integral part of the moment. Before returning his attention to Daniel, "We will need you to remain available for follow-up," he said, his tone unchanged. "Do not leave the area until further notice." And again, the instruction was simple, clear, leaving no space for interpretation. The sunlight remained constant, bright and unfiltered, casting sharp shadows along the pavement, illuminating every detail with the same clarity it had from the beginning. But now that light felt different, not just revealing what was happening, but preserving it, fixing it in a way that could not be altered or undone. Angela stepped back slightly, giving space as the process continued, her role in the moment already complete, and for a brief second, her eyes met Daniel's once more, not with judgment, not with hostility, but with a quiet finality, the kind that does not need to be spoken because it has already been understood. Around them, the city began to move again, slowly at first, then more steadily, as people returned to their paths, their conversations, their routines. But the energy of what had just occurred lingered in the air, subtle yet unmistakable, like a line that had been drawn and crossed in full view of everyone present. And as Daniel stood there, no longer directing the moment but standing within it, one truth settled in with a weight that could not be ignored, that under the same daylight he had trusted to validate his authority, everything he had done had also been seen, recorded, and understood in a way that left no room for assumption. No space for misinterpretation, only the clear, undeniable presence of what had actually happened. Time did not stop, but it slowed in a way that made every second feel deliberate, as if the moment itself was being examined from all angles at once, and Daniel Hayes could feel it in the way the agents moved around him, not circling, not confronting, but observing, documenting, their presence quiet yet unmistakably authoritative. One of them spoke softly into a device, relaying information in a tone that carried no emotion, just accuracy, while another stood a few feet away, eyes scanning the scene not for threats, but for context, for details that would matter later, details that would not change no matter how much time passed. Daniel remained still, his shoulders squared out of habit, but the tension in his stance was no longer hidden beneath confidence. It was exposed, visible in the slight tightening of his jaw, in the way his gaze shifted between Angela Brooks and the agents, trying to find a point of stability in a situation that had already moved beyond his control. Angela, on the other hand, had not changed at all, her posture steady, her breathing even, her attention focused not on the crowd, not on the cameras, but on the process unfolding in front of her, as if this moment was not unexpected, as if it was simply the next step in something larger, something that had been building long before this street, this day, this encounter. "We are going to need your statement," one of the agents said, addressing Daniel directly, his tone calm, professional, leaving no room for resistance yet offering no hostility. And Daniel nodded once, a small, controlled motion that acknowledged the request without fully revealing the weight behind it. He cleared his throat, preparing to speak, to explain the sequence of events as he had understood them. But as he began, the words felt different than they would have just minutes ago, less certain, less anchored. "I responded to a report," he said, his voice steady but measured. The individual matched the description provided, and as the sentence hung in the air, he realized that it sounded incomplete, not because it was untrue, but because it no longer carried the authority it once did. The agent listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, then nodded slightly as if acknowledging the statement while placing it into a larger framework that Daniel could not yet see. Nearby, Angela spoke again, her voice calm, precise. "There was no specific description given in my presence," she said, not raising her tone, not challenging him directly, simply adding a detail that shifted the weight of the narrative. And that single addition settled into the moment with quiet impact, not loud enough to disrupt, but strong enough to alter how everything would be understood moving forward. The crowd had grown quieter now, the earlier murmurs replaced by a focused stillness, people watching not for drama, but for resolution, for the moment when everything would make sense, even if that understanding came in pieces. Daniel's gaze flickered briefly toward the ground, then back up, recalibrating, adjusting. As he continued, "I followed procedure," he added. And the phrase sounded familiar, something he had said before, something he had believed in, but now it felt different, not wrong, but not complete either, as if procedure alone was no longer enough to define what had just happened. The agent made a brief note, his pen moving across a small pad with quiet efficiency, then looked up again, his attention steady. "We will review all available footage," he said, glancing briefly toward the phone still recording, "and we will proceed accordingly," and the words carried a finality that did not rely on volume, only on certainty. Angela stepped slightly to the side, allowing the process to continue without interruption. Her role now shifting from participant to observer, but even in that shift, her presence remained central, not because she demanded attention, but because everything that had unfolded traced back to her, to the moment she had been stopped, to the choice she had made to remain calm, to make a call instead of raising her voice. The sunlight still stretched across the pavement, casting long, defined shadows that seemed to anchor each person in place, and in that light, nothing could be softened, nothing could be hidden, every detail remained clear, preserved, undeniable. Daniel exhaled slowly, the breath controlled but deeper than before, as if releasing something he had been holding onto without realizing it, and as he stood there, surrounded not by confrontation but by process, one realization settled in with quiet certainty, that what had happened was no longer just an interaction, no longer just a decision made in the moment, it was now part of something larger, something that would be examined, understood, and remembered in a way that could not be reshaped. After the fact, and as the agents continued their work, as the city resumed its rhythm around them, as the crowd slowly began to disperse, that realization remained, steady and unchanging, because under the same clear sky that had witnessed everything from the beginning, the truth had not needed to be forced into the open, it had simply been allowed to reveal itself, one moment at a time. The edges of the moment began to soften as the crowd slowly thinned, not all at once but in small, almost hesitant steps, people lowering their phones, exchanging quiet glances, carrying fragments of what they had just witnessed back into their own lives, yet the space at the center of it all remained defined, held together by the presence of those who stayed, those who understood that what had happened here was not finished, only transitioning into something more formal, more permanent. Daniel Hayes stood in that space, aware now of every detail in a way he had not been before, the weight of his badge against his chest, the faint sound of his own breathing, the subtle shift of fabric as he adjusted his stance without realizing it, and for the first time, he was not thinking about what to do next, he was thinking about what had already been done, replaying the sequence in his mind, each step, each word, each assumption, no longer as isolated actions but as a chain that had led directly to this point. One of the agents approached again, holding a small device. "We will need to document your account formally," he said, his tone unchanged, steady and neutral, and Daniel nodded, the motion slower now, more deliberate, as if each acknowledgement carried more weight than before. Angela Brooks remained nearby, not distant, not disengaged, but positioned just outside the immediate exchange, her presence quiet yet undeniable, and as she watched the process unfold, there was no urgency in her posture, no sign that she needed to assert anything further, because everything that mattered had already been set into motion. The sunlight continued to stretch across the pavement, reflecting off windows, casting long lines that seemed to anchor the scene in place, and in that light, nothing felt temporary, nothing felt like it could be dismissed or forgotten. "Please start from the beginning," the agent said, and Daniel took a breath, deeper this time, steadying himself before speaking. "I received a call," he began, his voice controlled, but the cadence different now, slower, more careful, as if he was choosing each word not just to explain, but to understand, "a report of suspicious activity in the area," and as he spoke, he could hear the phrasing, could recognize the familiarity of it, yet it no longer carried the same certainty it once had, because now there was context, now there was perspective, now there was more than just his interpretation of events. Angela shifted her gaze slightly, not interrupting, not correcting, simply listening, her expression unchanged, but there was something in the stillness of her attention that reinforced the gravity of the moment, because this was no longer about confrontation, it was about clarity, about allowing every detail to be placed exactly where it belonged. Daniel continued, "I approached the individual," he said, and even as he used the word, he felt the distance in it, the way it separated the moment from the person standing just a few feet away, and he paused briefly, recalibrating. "Angela Brooks," he corrected, the name settling into the space with a different kind of weight, more precise, more grounded, and as he continued, the narrative began to shift, not dramatically, not all at once, but subtly, as if the truth itself was guiding the words into a clearer form. The agent listened, making occasional notes, his focus unwavering, while another agent stepped slightly closer to Angela, speaking with her in a low voice, confirming details, aligning timelines, their exchange calm and efficient, reinforcing the sense that this was not a reaction, but a process already in motion. The city around them continued to move, cars passing, footsteps resuming, conversations picking up where they had left off, but within that movement, the center remained unchanged, a point of stillness where everything was being examined, understood, and recorded. Daniel reached the part of the story where he had asked for compliance, where he had made the decision to place restraints, and for a brief moment, his voice faltered, not breaking, not losing control, just pausing, as if the weight of that decision had finally caught up with him in a way it had not before. He continued, finishing the account, his tone steady again, but quieter, more reflective, and when he stopped speaking, the silence that followed was not empty, it was full, carrying the presence of everything that had just been said. The agent nodded once, acknowledging the statement, then glanced briefly toward Angela, as if aligning both perspectives within the same framework. Before returning his attention to Daniel, "We will review all information and proceed accordingly," he said, the words familiar now, but carrying a deeper resonance, because they no longer referred to a routine follow-up, they referred to something that had already begun to take shape. Angela stepped forward slightly then, not to interrupt, but to add one final detail, her voice calm, measured. "There were multiple witnesses," she said, "and the interaction was recorded from several angles, and the statement did not accuse, did not challenge, it simply completed the picture, ensuring that nothing was left unacknowledged." Daniel nodded once, a small motion, but this time it was not just acknowledgement, it was understanding, the kind that comes when there is no longer any distance between what happened and how it will be seen. And as the agents continued their work, as the last few onlookers moved on, as the city returned fully to its rhythm, one truth settled into the space they left behind, quiet but permanent, that under the clear, open sky where everything had been visible from the start, the moment had not just been witnessed, it had been defined, and that definition would remain long after the street itself had moved on. The formalities did not end the moment, they deepened it, transforming what had already happened into something that would carry forward beyond the street, beyond the sunlight, beyond the quiet crowd that had now mostly dispersed. And as the last few bystanders drifted away, their footsteps blending back into the rhythm of the city, the space that remained felt more defined, more intentional, as if it had shifted from a public scene into something more precise, more controlled. Daniel Hayes stood within that space, no longer the center of attention in the way he had been before, but still very much at the center of the process, and the difference between those two realities settled in slowly, not with impact, but with clarity, because attention fades, but process continues. One of the agents stepped slightly closer, holding a tablet now, its screen reflecting the bright daylight. "We have initiated preliminary review," he said, his voice even, "body camera footage, public recordings, and dispatch logs will be synchronized," and the words carried a technical precision that made it clear this was not about interpretation anymore, it was about alignment, about ensuring that every angle, every second, every detail would match, or not match, exactly as it had occurred. Daniel nodded again, the motion almost automatic, but his gaze lingered on the device for a fraction longer than necessary, as if recognizing that whatever had been captured there would not rely on memory, would not shift over time, it would remain fixed, consistent, unchanging. Angela Brooks listened without interruption, her posture unchanged, her presence still grounded in that same calm awareness, and when she spoke, it was not to add anything new, but to confirm what had already been set into motion. "The timestamp should align with the initial stop at 10:42, she said, her voice measured, and the call was placed at approximately 10:45. And her precision did not come across as defensive, it came across as factual, as if she were simply placing markers along a timeline that already existed. The agent nodded once, acknowledging the information, then turned slightly to another member of the team, exchanging a brief, quiet instruction that did not need to be heard to be understood, because everything about their movement suggested coordination, familiarity, a system operating exactly as it was designed to. The city noise had returned fully now, cars passing steadily, voices blending into the background, but within that contained space, the atmosphere remained focused, almost insulated from the rest of the world, as if time itself had narrowed to this single point where everything mattered. Daniel shifted his weight slightly, a small adjustment that seemed more about grounding than comfort, and for the first time since the moment began, he allowed himself to look directly at Angela without searching for a reaction, without expecting a response, just observing, and what he saw was not someone who had just been stopped, Not someone who had just been restrained, but someone who had remained exactly who she was from the beginning, unchanged by the situation, unchanged by the shift, unchanged by the outcome. That realization settled in quietly, but firmly, because it reframed everything, not as an isolated decision, not as a misunderstanding, but as something deeper, something tied to perception, to assumption, to the way a moment can be defined before it even unfolds. "You will be contacted for a formal interview," the agent said, returning his attention to Daniel. "Do not discuss this incident with anyone outside official channels," and the instruction was clear, direct, leaving no ambiguity, and Daniel responded with a simple nod, the kind that acknowledged not just the words, but the weight behind them. Angela stepped back slightly then, creating a bit more distance between herself and the immediate exchange, not withdrawing, but allowing the process to continue without her presence being required at every second, and as she did, she glanced briefly at the street beyond, at the people who had already moved on, at the city that had resumed its pace, and there was something in that glance that suggested perspective, that this moment, as significant as it was, existed within a much larger context, one that extended far beyond a single interaction on a single morning. The agents began to gather their materials, not leaving, but transitioning, shifting from initial response to ongoing procedure, their movements efficient, unhurried, reinforcing the sense that this was not an ending, but a continuation. Daniel remained where he was, his posture still upright, but now carrying a different kind of awareness, one that did not rely on authority, but on understanding, on recognizing that what had unfolded could not be undone, could not be reframed, only acknowledged and examined. And as the sunlight continued to stretch across the pavement, illuminating every detail with the same clarity it had from the start, one truth remained steady beneath it all: that in a moment where everything had been visible, where every action had been seen, the outcome was not shaped by who held power at the beginning, but by what was revealed by the end. The shift from observation to consequence did not arrive with noise or urgency. It unfolded quietly, almost imperceptibly at first, like a current moving beneath the surface, and as the agents finalized their initial documentation, the atmosphere around Daniel Hayes began to change in a way that was not visible in any single movement, but present in all of them together. The distance between him and the others remained small in physical terms, just a few feet of pavement under the same bright sky, but the space felt different now, more defined, more deliberate, as if an invisible boundary had been drawn, not by force, but by understanding. One of the agents stepped slightly aside, speaking into a secure line, his voice low but clear, relaying identifiers, timestamps, and locations with a precision that suggested this moment was already being integrated into a larger system, one that extended far beyond the street they stood on. And Daniel listened without meaning to, catching fragments of information that made it clear this was no longer a contained situation. It was expanding, connecting, becoming part of something that would be reviewed from multiple angles, by multiple people, none of whom had been present when it began. Angela Brooks remained composed, her posture unchanged, her attention steady, and when she glanced briefly toward the agent speaking, there was no surprise in her expression, no reaction that suggested uncertainty, only recognition, as if this stage of the process was exactly what she had expected all along. The sunlight continued to illuminate everything with the same clarity it had from the beginning, but now it seemed to hold each detail in place, preserving it, ensuring that nothing could be overlooked or misremembered. Daniel adjusted his stance again, a subtle shift that spoke more to internal recalibration than physical comfort, and for a moment, his gaze moved beyond the immediate scene, following the flow of the street, the people who had already returned to their routines, the vehicles passing by without slowing. And there was something in that movement that contrasted sharply with the stillness he now occupied, because while everything else continued forward, he remained fixed within this point of transition, where the past few minutes were no longer just events, but evidence. "We will be forwarding this to command review," one of the agents said, his tone even, directed toward Daniel but carrying a broader implication, and the word settled into the space with quiet weight, not dramatic, not emphasized, but definitive, because they marked the point where this moment moved beyond immediate resolution and into formal evaluation. Daniel nodded once, slower than before, the motion deliberate, as if acknowledging not just the statement, but everything it represented. And for the first time since the interaction began, there was no attempt to respond, no effort to clarify or reinforce, just acceptance of the process as it unfolded. Angela stepped slightly closer to the agent who had been coordinating the response, her voice calm as she added one final clarification: All recordings should reflect consistent timeline alignment, she said, and the phrasing was precise. Not casual, not conversational, reinforcing her role within the system without needing to emphasize it, and the agent nodded in agreement, already making a note. The presence of additional units remained steady, not overwhelming, not intrusive, but reinforcing, creating a framework around the moment that ensured it would be handled exactly as required, no more, no less. Daniel's attention returned to Angela briefly, and this time, there was no attempt to read her expression. No search for reaction, only recognition, because what stood in front of him was no longer defined by the initial encounter. It was defined by everything that had followed, by the clarity, the composure, the precision with which she had moved through each step without raising her voice, without resisting, without needing to. The city noise continued to flow around them, steady and unbroken, but within that contained space, the silence carried a different kind of presence now, not empty, not uncertain, but resolved, as if the outcome had already taken shape even if it had not yet been fully expressed. "You are cleared to return to your duties for now," the agent said finally, addressing Daniel with the same measured tone, pending further instruction, and the phrasing carried a subtle distinction, not a release, not a dismissal, but a temporary transition, one that left the process open, ongoing. Daniel inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the instruction, but did not move immediately, and in that hesitation, there was a shift, small but significant, because for the first time, action was no longer automatic, no longer driven by routine. It required consideration, awareness of what had just occurred and what it meant moving forward. Angela turned then, not abruptly, not with finality, but with quiet intention, her role in the moment complete, her presence no longer required at the center of the process, and as she began to walk away, her steps measured, steady. She did not look back, not because she was dismissing the moment, but because there was nothing left to confirm, nothing left to prove. The sunlight followed her path across the pavement, casting a long, defined shadow that moved with her. And for a brief moment, Daniel watched, not out of curiosity, not out of confusion, but out of understanding, because what had just unfolded was not about a single decision, not about a single interaction. It was about what happens when a moment is seen clearly, fully, without distortion, and in that clarity, there is no need for noise, no need for force, only the quiet, undeniable presence of truth taking its place exactly where it belongs. The street returned to its rhythm, but something intangible remained, something that did not belong to the movement of cars or the flow of pedestrians, something quieter, heavier, anchored in the space where everything had unfolded just minutes before. Daniel Hayes finally took a step back, not directed, not commanded, just a natural shift as the structure around him began to dissolve into routine again. And yet nothing about it felt routine anymore, not the way the sunlight hit the pavement, not the way his uniform sat on his shoulders, not even the sound of his own footsteps as he moved slightly to the side. The agents had begun to disperse into their next tasks, some remaining nearby, others stepping toward their vehicles, speaking into devices, coordinating details that would continue long after this moment had ended, and their presence, though less concentrated now, still carried the same quiet authority, the kind that did not need to stay visible to remain in effect. Daniel glanced toward the direction Angela Brooks had walked, her figure now blending into the broader movement of the city, no longer the focal point, no longer surrounded by attention, just another person moving forward. And yet the absence of her presence in that space felt more significant than anything that had happened while she stood there, because it marked the point where control had fully shifted, not just in the moment, but in meaning. He reached up briefly, adjusting the edge of his collar, a small, almost automatic motion, but even that felt different now, like a habit disconnected from certainty, something he was doing because it was familiar, not because it restored anything. The radio at his shoulder remained silent for a few seconds, longer than usual, and when it finally crackled to life again, the voice was the standard dispatch tone he had known for years, routine, procedural, asking for status updates from units across the district, and the normalcy of it contrasted sharply with what had just occurred, because while the system moved on, the moment itself had not simply disappeared, it had been absorbed, recorded, placed into a sequence that would be reviewed, analyzed, understood. Daniel pressed the button slowly, his voice steady. Unit 7-4, status unchanged, he said, the word simple, but carrying a weight that was not reflected in their tone, and as he released the button, he realized that even his own voice sounded different to him now, not weaker, not uncertain, but more aware, as if every word carried more consequence than before. The pavement beneath him held the same markings, the same faint cracks, the same scattered reflections of sunlight. But it no longer felt like just another point along his patrol route, it felt like a place where something had been revealed, something that could not be unseen once it had been brought into the open. A passing car slowed briefly at the intersection, the driver glancing toward the scene before continuing on. Unaware of the full context, unaware of the details that had unfolded, and that contrast settled in quietly, because not everyone would know, not everyone would understand, but the ones who needed to, the ones responsible for evaluating what had happened, they would see everything, exactly as it was. One of the agents approached again, not with urgency, not with confrontation, just with quiet purpose. "You will receive further instruction by end of day," he said, his tone unchanged, "ensure availability," and Daniel nodded once, the motion more grounded this time, not automatic, but intentional, acknowledging not just the instruction, but the process behind it. The agent gave a brief nod in return, then stepped away, his role in this moment complete, leaving Daniel standing at the edge of a space that no longer belonged to him in the way it had before. The city continued to move, the sunlight remained steady, and yet there was a difference in how everything felt, as if the clarity of the moment had altered the way it would be remembered, not as a dramatic event, not as something loud or chaotic, but as something precise, something defined by what had been seen and what had been understood. Daniel exhaled slowly, the breath measured, controlled, and as he stood there, preparing to return to the rhythm of his shift, one realization settled in with a quiet permanence. That authority is not defined by the moment it is used, but by the way it is held up to light, examined, and understood. And under that same daylight that had revealed everything from the beginning, there had been no shadows to hide behind, no noise to distort the truth, only the clear, steady presence of what had actually happened, and the knowledge that it would not be forgotten. The shift did not end when the street cleared, it followed him, quiet and persistent, carried not in the noise of the city but in the silence between his own thoughts. And as Daniel Hayes resumed his position along the sidewalk, the routine he had relied on for years felt different, not broken, not gone, but altered in a way that could not be ignored. He glanced at his watch, the time now just past 11 in the morning. And the number itself seemed insignificant compared to what those minutes had contained, because what had happened was not measured in seconds, it was measured in realization, in the gradual understanding of how quickly control can change when the context shifts. The radio continued its steady rhythm, dispatch calling out locations, units responding, the structure of the system holding firm as it always had. But now each call carried a subtle reminder, not of what needed to be done, but of how it needed to be done, because the difference between routine and consequence had been made clear in a way that did not require explanation. Daniel took a slow step forward, then another, moving back into the flow of his patrol, but his awareness remained anchored in what had just unfolded, replaying the sequence not with urgency, not with defensiveness, but with a clarity that had not been present before. And in that clarity, details surfaced differently, not as isolated actions, but as connected choices, each one leading to the next with a precision that now felt undeniable. The sunlight had shifted slightly, casting new angles across the buildings, stretching shadows in different directions, but its presence remained constant, illuminating everything with the same consistency, and that consistency felt symbolic now, because nothing about the moment had been hidden, nothing had been obscured. Everything had been visible from the beginning. A passerby glanced briefly at him, then continued walking, unaware of the full context, unaware of the significance of the space they had just crossed, and that contrast settled in quietly, because the world does not pause for understanding, it moves forward, leaving moments like this to be processed by those directly involved. Daniel reached up again, adjusting the radio at his shoulder, and this time the motion felt more intentional, less automatic, as if he were grounding himself in the structure of his role while recognizing the responsibility that came with it, not just in action, but in perception, in awareness, in the understanding that every decision exists within a larger frame than it might appear in the moment. Across the street, a storefront window reflected his image back at him, uniform intact, posture steady, nothing outwardly changed, and yet the reflection carried a difference that could not be seen, only felt, because what had shifted was not external, it was internal, a recalibration of how he viewed the authority he carried, not as something to be assumed, but as something to be applied with precision. With awareness of the context in which it exists, the radio crackled again, a routine call, a minor incident a few blocks away, nothing unusual, nothing urgent, and Daniel pressed the button, his response steady. Unit 7-4, I am in the area. The words clear, controlled, but now layered with a different kind of intention, because he was no longer just responding, he was considering, measuring, ensuring that what had just been revealed would not be ignored as he moved forward. The city continued its rhythm around him, unchanged in its pace, but the way he moved within it had shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way that others would notice, but in a way that would influence every interaction that followed, every decision, every moment where assumption might once have filled the space where awareness now stood. Somewhere in the distance, a siren rose briefly, then faded, blending back into the ambient noise of the city, and Daniel paused for just a second, not stopping completely, just enough to take in the sound, to register it differently than before, not as background, but as part of a system that relies on clarity, on accuracy, on understanding. And as he continued down the sidewalk, the events of the morning did not fade into memory, they remained present, not as a burden, but as a reference, a point of understanding that would shape what came next, because under the same daylight that had revealed everything so clearly, there had been no room for distortion, no space for misunderstanding, only the quiet, steady presence of truth, and the realization that once it is seen, it cannot be unseen. By early afternoon, the city had fully reclaimed its pace, the brief disruption of the morning absorbed into the steady flow of movement and noise. Yet for Daniel Hayes, the hours that followed did not pass in the same way they once would have, because each step, each call, each interaction now carried a subtle layer of awareness that had not been there before. The routine continued, dispatch calls came in, minor situations were addressed, conversations remained professional and controlled, but beneath it all, there was a quiet recalibration taking place, not something visible to others, but something deeply present in the way he paused before speaking, in the way he observed more carefully, in the way he allowed space for understanding rather than filling it with assumption. The sunlight had softened slightly, shifting from the sharp intensity of late morning to the warmer tone of early afternoon, casting longer shadows across the pavement, and in that change, there was a sense of transition, not an ending, but a continuation, a reminder that time moves forward regardless of what has been revealed within it. Daniel stood near the edge of a crosswalk, watching as pedestrians moved in coordinated rhythm with the traffic signals, their steps aligned with a system that functioned because it relied on clarity, on predictable patterns, and that observation settled into his thoughts in a way that felt unexpectedly relevant, because the system he was part of operated in much the same way, depending not just on authority, but on precision, on the ability to interpret situations accurately, without distortion. His radio remained active, the steady exchange of information continuing without interruption, but now each transmission felt like part of a larger framework, one that required more than just response. It required awareness of how each action would be seen, understood, and recorded. The memory of the morning did not replay with intensity, it did not demand attention, it simply remained present, steady, like a reference point that could not be ignored, and in that presence, there was no need to justify, no need to resist, only the recognition that what had happened had already taken its place within a process that would unfold with its own momentum. A notification came through his device, not loud, not urgent, just a simple alert, and when he checked it, the message was brief, direct, instructing him to report for formal review later that day, and the words carried a quiet finality, not unexpected, not surprising, but definitive, marking the transition from immediate response to structured evaluation. Daniel read the message once, then again, not because he needed to understand it, but because it represented the next step, the continuation of something that had already begun, and as he lowered the device, his gaze lifted back to the street, to the people moving, to the city continuing as it always did, and there was something grounding in that continuity, something that reminded him that while moments like the one he had experienced could shift perspective, they did not stop the world. They simply changed how one moved within it. Across the street, a group of people waited for the signal to change, their attention focused on the light above, trusting that when it turned, they would move forward safely, and that simple act of trust carried more weight now, because it reflected the foundation of the role he held, not just enforcement, but responsibility, not just action, but judgment, the ability to navigate situations with clarity rather than assumption. Daniel exhaled slowly, the breath steady, controlled, and as he stood there, the realization that had been forming throughout the day settled more firmly into place, not as a sudden insight, but as a quiet understanding that authority is not defined by the ability to act, but by the ability to see clearly before acting, to recognize the full context of a moment before deciding how to move within it. The sunlight continued its slow shift across the sky, marking the passage of time in a way that required no acknowledgement, and as Daniel resumed his patrol, stepping forward with a measured pace, the events of the morning remained with him, not as a weight, but as a guide, something that would influence every decision moving forward, not through force, but through awareness. And under that same sky, where everything had once been illuminated with unfiltered clarity, the truth of what had happened did not fade, it remained steady, woven into the fabric of the day, shaping what came next not through noise or confrontation, but through the quiet, undeniable presence of understanding that once seen, could not be set aside. By the time the afternoon light began to fade into the softer tones of early evening, the city had fully absorbed the day, its rhythm uninterrupted, its pace steady, and yet for Daniel Hayes, the hours had not passed unnoticed. They had settled into him in a way that did not demand attention but refused to disappear, shaping his awareness with a quiet persistence that followed him through every step of his patrol. The call to report for formal review came just before the end of his shift, not unexpected, not dramatic, simply a continuation of the process that had begun under the bright clarity of that morning, and as he made his way toward the building where that next step would take place, the environment around him felt both familiar and changed, the same streets, the same structures, the same system, but viewed now through a lens that had been sharpened by what he had seen and what he had understood. The sunlight, once sharp and revealing, now stretched low across the horizon, casting long shadows that softened the edges of everything it touched, and in that transition, there was a quiet contrast, because while the light had changed, the clarity of the moment it had revealed had not. It remained steady, unaltered, carried forward not in brightness, but in memory, in understanding, in the way it had reshaped the meaning of a single interaction. Daniel paused briefly at the entrance, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition, because crossing that threshold was not just a physical movement, it was a continuation of accountability, of review, of placing the events of the day into a framework where they would be examined with the same precision that had defined every step since they had unfolded. Inside, the environment was controlled, quiet, structured, the kind of place where decisions were not made in moments, but through careful evaluation, through alignment of facts, through clarity of perspective, and as he stepped forward, the presence of that structure felt different than it had before, not as something external, but as something he was now fully part of, not directing, not controlling, but participating in with an awareness that had not been there at the start of the day. The details of the review process unfolded without urgency, without raised voices, without confrontation, just as the moment on the street had, because what mattered was not how loudly something was addressed, but how clearly it was understood. And as Daniel provided his account, as the recordings were referenced, as the timeline was aligned, there was no need for interpretation, no space for assumption, only the steady, undeniable presence of what had been seen. Angela Brooks was not there in that room, but her presence remained within the process, carried through the details, through the clarity of her actions, through the precision with which the moment had been documented, and in that absence, there was a quiet understanding that this had never been about confrontation. It had been about revelation, about allowing the truth to stand on its own without force, without escalation. As the review continued, Daniel found himself not resisting, not defending, but recognizing, understanding the sequence of events in a way that extended beyond his initial perspective, seeing how each decision, each assumption, had shaped the outcome in a way that was now clear, undeniable, and in that clarity, there was no need to argue, no need to justify, only the acknowledgement that what had happened was now part of a record that would remain. The evening light filtered through the windows, softer now, less intense, but still present, casting a muted glow across the room, and in that light, there was a sense of completion, not of the process itself, which would continue, but of the moment that had begun under the bright, unfiltered clarity of the morning, because what had been revealed then had carried through every step that followed, unchanged, unaltered, consistent, and as Daniel stood there, listening, responding, participating in the final stages of that day's events, one truth settled into place with a quiet permanence, not spoken, not emphasized, but understood, that he had believed the badge gave him control over the moment, but what he had learned, under that same daylight that revealed everything, was that the moment itself, when seen clearly, defines the truth, and that truth, once revealed, does not belong to the one who acts, it belongs to the light that shows it for what it is.